Apple and Samsung fought one of the fiercest corporate battles of the 21st century. It was a high-stakes war fought not with bullets, but with smartphones, patents, and billions of dollars on the line. For nearly a decade, these two tech titans clashed in courtrooms and marketplaces around the globe. What began as a partnership turned into a rivalry of epic proportions, a thermonuclear conflict driven by pride, innovation, and the ambition of visionary leaders on both sides. In this war, Steve Jobs, Tim Cook, and Lee Kun-hee emerged as central figures, each leading their companies with unwavering determination. The story of Apple versus Samsung is a true corporate thriller, a saga of ingenious breakthroughs, alleged betrayals, courtroom drama, and a contrast in corporate philosophies that ultimately shaped the modern smartphone industry. The stage for the smartphone war was set by the rise of two very different companies. Apple, co-founded by Steve Jobs in California, built its reputation on visionary products and a tightly controlled ecosystem. By the mid-2000s, Apple had revolutionized personal electronics with the iPod and was known for its innovate-at-all-costs culture. Jobs personified Apple's ethos, perfectionist design, integrated hardware-software experiences, and a flair for dramatic product launches. Samsung Electronics, on the other hand, grew out of South Korea's largest conglomerate and was led by Chairman Lee Kun-hee, son of Samsung's founder. Under Lee's leadership, Samsung transformed from a maker of low-cost appliances into a global technology powerhouse. In 1993, dissatisfied with Samsung's mediocre reputation, Lee famously exhorted his executives to change everything except your wife and children, initiating a radical corporate overhaul focused on quality and innovation. This new philosophy spurred Samsung to shed its copycat image and strive for world-class products. By the early 2000s, Samsung had become a top producer of memory chips, display panels, and consumer electronics, even surpassing Japanese rivals in industries like TVs and semiconductors. Despite their differences, Apple and Samsung were not immediate enemies. In fact, they started as business partners. Samsung's component divisions supplied critical parts for Apple devices, flash memory, display screens, and processors, making Samsung one of Apple's most important suppliers. The two companies complemented each other. Apple designed trend-setting gadgets, and Samsung's technology and manufacturing muscle helped build them. Throughout the 2000s, this partnership thrived quietly behind the scenes. But tectonic shifts in the tech world were about to bring Apple and Samsung into direct conflict. In January 2007, Steve Jobs took the stage in San Francisco and unveiled the Apple iPhone, a product that would change the world. The iPhone merged a phone, iPod, and internet communicator into a single device with a multi-touch screen, a revolutionary design that instantly made every other phone look outdated. Jobs' presentation dazzled consumers and sent competitors scrambling. The smartphone revolution had begun. Samsung's leadership, watching from half a world away, immediately understood the stakes. At that time, Samsung was producing a range of mobile phones, some running early smartphone software like Windows Mobile or Nokia's Symbian OS, but none had the iPhone's polish. The iPhone's launch upended the industry's hierarchy. Former giants like Nokia and BlackBerry were caught flat-footed, and Samsung knew it had to act fast or be left behind. Just months after the iPhone's debut, Google released Android, an open-source mobile operating system that any manufacturer could use. Samsung eagerly embraced Android. By 2009, Samsung released its first Android smartphones, and in 2010, it launched the Galaxy S, an Android phone with a touchscreen interface that bore more than a passing resemblance to the iPhone. The Galaxy S featured a grid of colorful icons in a rectangular form with rounded corners, design traits pioneered by Apple. Samsung's device was an immediate hit and quickly positioned Samsung as the leading contender in the nascent Android camp. Inside Apple, alarm bells were ringing. The iPhone had given Apple a massive lead, but suddenly Samsung was catching up, leveraging Google's Android platform to offer iPhone-like capabilities. Steve Jobs, initially proud to have Samsung as a partner, supplying iPhone components, now watched with growing concern as Samsung became Apple's fiercest competitor in smartphones. The seeds of the rivalry had been planted. By 2010, the friendly facade between Apple and Samsung was beginning to crack. Apple was riding high on the iPhone's success, and Samsung, once just a supplier, was now a fast-rising smartphone brand. The tension was personified by Steve Jobs himself. He believed Android was a direct rip-off of the iPhone's innovations. "I'm going to destroy Android because it's a stolen product. I'm willing to go thermonuclear war on this," Jobs declared, making his fury plain. In his eyes, companies like Samsung, which had become the largest Android phone maker, were profiting from Apple's ideas. This was nothing less than a betrayal. Yet Apple initially hesitated to attack Samsung outright. Tim Cook, Apple's chief operating officer and later CEO, knew how vital Samsung was to Apple's supply chain. Apple was spending billions on Samsung components each year. Suing their partner could jeopardize production of the iPhone and iPad. For a time, pragmatism won out over anger. Apple focused its legal firepower on smaller Android phone makers first, HTC and others, filing patent suits in 2009 and 2010. Samsung watched warily as Apple's legal battles with HTC hinted at what might come. Behind closed doors, Apple tried a gentler approach with Samsung. In August 2010, Apple sent a warning to Samsung, claiming that certain Samsung smartphones and tablets were copying Apple's patented designs. Because Samsung was still considered a trusted partner, Apple sought to resolve the issue without a public fight. Apple proposed a licensing deal. In October 2010, Apple executives met with Samsung and offered to license Apple's patents for about $30 per smartphone and $40 per tablet that Samsung sold. This was an olive branch, a way for Samsung to pay royalties and continue business without a lawsuit. For context, around that same time, companies like HTC were agreeing to pay Microsoft a few dollars per Android phone for patent licenses. Apple's much higher fee reflected how strongly it valued its iPhone intellectual property. Samsung refused the deal. Exactly why Samsung declined is a matter of debate. Perhaps the fees were too high, or Samsung was confident it could win without paying. But the outcome was clear. The last chance to avoid war had evaporated. The partnership was now secondary to the looming battle for smartphone supremacy. Steve Jobs took Samsung's refusal as the final straw. Apple's leadership felt they had no choice left but to defend what they saw as their crown jewels of innovation. In early 2011, the simmering tensions finally boiled over. Apple's lawyers prepared a barrage of legal claims, and the era of Apple versus Samsung as adversaries truly began. On April 15, 2011, Apple officially launched its attack, filing a lawsuit against Samsung in a California court. The accusation was explosive. Apple claimed Samsung had slavishly copied the design and user experience of the iPhone and iPad. Apple's complaint pointed to Samsung's Galaxy series phones and tablets, devices that Apple argued were iPhone and iPad knockoffs in everything from icons to hardware design. The message was clear. Apple believed Samsung stole Apple's innovations instead of creating its own. Samsung's response was immediate and aggressive. Within days, Samsung countersued Apple, denying any wrongdoing and accusing Apple of infringing Samsung's own patents related to wireless technology. More strikingly, Samsung expanded the fight to a global scale. The South Korean company filed lawsuits in Japan, South Korea, Germany, and other countries, claiming Apple was the infringer in those jurisdictions. What started as a battle in California quickly became a worldwide legal brawl, with both companies jockeying for position on multiple continents. By late 2011, the scope of the conflict was staggering. Around 30 lawsuits were pending between Apple and Samsung across North America, Europe, Asia, and Australia. Each side sought bans on the other's products. In some cases, they succeeded, at least temporarily. In August 2011, Apple convinced a court in Germany to ban Samsung's Galaxy Tab 10.1 tablet, arguing it copied the iPad's design. In Australia, Apple won an injunction delaying the Galaxy Tab's launch as well. Samsung fired back by suing to ban sales of the iPhone and iPad in its home turf of South Korea and elsewhere. At one point, Samsung managed a brief ban on certain iPhone and iPad models in Germany, though only for a few hours before that order was stayed. The legal skirmishes seesawed. Apple would win one injunction, then lose another case, Samsung would score a point in one country, only to be rebuffed in another. By the end of 2011, the two companies were entangled in about 20 cases in 10 countries, a number that would swell to 50-plus cases worldwide by mid-2012. One especially controversial ruling came from the UK High Court in mid-2012. The British judge concluded that Samsung's Galaxy tablets did not infringe Apple's design, with a damningly backhanded rationale. He said Samsung's products were not as cool as Apple's. Essentially, that Samsung's tablets lacked the distinctive visual flair of the iPad. As part of the judgment, Apple was even ordered to publicly state that Samsung did not copy the iPad, a humbling directive that Apple complied with rather grudgingly. Apple's first attempt at posting the notice was deemed too cheeky and had to be corrected. This UK episode highlighted how opinions differed across the globe. In some eyes, Samsung wasn't copying. In others, it was. And it added an ironic footnote that Samsung tablets were simply not cool enough to be confused with Apple's. Despite the global salvos, the center of gravity remained the United States, the world's biggest technology market. All the smaller battles were building toward a grand confrontation in a California courtroom where Apple first filed suit. Throughout late 2011 and early 2012, both sides geared up for this U.S. trial, gathering evidence and formulating their strategies. The federal judge overseeing the case, Judge Lucy Koh, tried to rein in the chaos. She even ordered Apple and Samsung to attempt a settlement negotiation before the trial. In May 2012, Apple's CEO Tim Cook and Samsung's CEO Choi Gi-sung, along with their lawyers, met behind closed doors in San Francisco to see if they could resolve the dispute peacefully. The tech world held its breath. Could a handshake deal stop the war? The talks went nowhere. Neither company was willing to surrender its claims or its pride. The time for compromise had passed. With settlement efforts failed, it was full steam ahead to the big trial. In July 2012, the Apple versus Samsung trial commenced in San Jose, California, ground zero for the smartphone war. The courtroom showdown between Apple and Samsung in the summer of 2012 was nothing short of dramatic. On one side, Apple's legal team presented a narrative of idea theft, telling the jury that Samsung had deliberately ripped off Apple's iPhone design after seeing its success. On the other side, Samsung's attorneys argued that Apple was trying to stifle competition to compensate for having fallen behind in the market. Over several weeks, both sides marshaled evidence and witnesses in a trial closely watched by media and tech insiders. The proceedings offered a rare peek into the secretive development labs and strategy rooms of both companies, and emotions ran high. Apple's case homed in on specific design details. Lawyers showed images of Samsung phones before and after the iPhone's release, insinuating that Samsung's designs took a sharp turn towards iPhone-like features once Apple's product hit the scene. They revealed internal Samsung documents in which Samsung's engineers explicitly compared the Galaxy phone against the iPhone, feature by feature. These comparisons, Apple argued, proved Samsung slavishly copied the iPhone's look and feel. Apple engineers and designers, even the famed Apple design chief Jony Ive, gave testimony about the painstaking work that went into creating the iPhone's interface and shape. To Apple, Samsung's devices were essentially imposters riding on Apple's hard-won innovations. Samsung fought back by trying to poke holes in Apple's claims of originality. Samsung's team pointed out that rounded rectangles and touchscreens existed in prior products, and that Apple's iPhone itself was inspired by earlier concepts in the industry. Samsung also asserted that Apple had infringed Samsung's patents on wireless transmission technology, crucial features for any smartphone, framing Apple as the infringer who didn't fairly pay for others' innovations. It was a classic offense versus defense duel, with billions at stake. The trial had its share of theatrical moments and frustrations. At one point, Samsung's lawyers attempted to introduce evidence showing a Sony-designed concept phone that allegedly inspired the iPhone. Evidence Judge Koh had excluded as irrelevant. When Samsung publicly released the excluded material to the press, it infuriated the judge. The judge saw it as an attempt to sway public opinion since it couldn't sway the jury, and she reprimanded Samsung's counsel for what she called an intentional attempt to pollute the jury pool, though the jury was instructed to ignore media coverage. Tensions in the courtroom ran so high that Judge Lucy Koh, exasperated by both sides' legal maneuvers, quipped in frustration, "Unless you're smoking crack, you know these witnesses aren't going to be called." This remark came after Apple submitted a 75-page list of potential witnesses, far too many to realistically cover at the last minute, illustrating how combative and drawn out the proceedings had become. The judge's candid outbursts drew laughter in court and headlines in the press, underscoring how even the patience of a U.S. federal judge was being tested by this epic feud. Meanwhile, the human drama of the witnesses added emotional weight to the dry talk of patents. Apple's marketing chief, Phil Schiller, testified that he was shocked at how similar Samsung smartphones looked to the iPhone when they first appeared. He described feeling blindsided that a trusted partner like Samsung would mimic Apple's products so closely, revealing the sense of betrayal within Apple's ranks. On Samsung's side, executives insisted they hadn't copied, but simply responded to industry trends and consumer demand. Samsung's lawyers argued Apple was acting like a monopolist, trying to claim generic smartphone features as its own. After weeks of testimony, the case went to the jury, 9 ordinary citizens tasked with untangling a highly technical dispute. It didn't take them long. On August 24, 2012, after just 3 days of deliberation, the jury delivered a stunning verdict, largely in Apple's favor. The jury found that Samsung had willfully infringed several of Apple's patents, both design patents, covering the look of the iPhone and iPad, and utility patents, covering software behaviors. They decided that Samsung had copied distinctive iPhone features like the bounce-back effect, the elastic scroll behavior, pinch to zoom, and the overall icon grid design with rounded corners. Out of the many Samsung products in question, the jury concluded that 26 Samsung devices violated Apple's rights. The message could not have been clearer. The jurors believed Samsung had copied elements of the iPhone on a massive scale. The damages award was equally dramatic. The jury ordered Samsung to pay Apple $1 billion and $50 million in damages, an enormous sum, and one of the largest patent verdicts in history at that time. It was a resounding victory for Apple, far beyond a symbolic win. The verdict vindicated Apple's narrative that Samsung stole its ideas and served as a public rebuke to Samsung's tactics. In the court of public opinion, Samsung suddenly had the label of an infringer. Samsung, for its part, won none of the claims in its countersuit during this trial. The jury rejected Samsung's arguments that Apple had infringed Samsung's technical patents. It was a clean sweep for Apple in the first round. Outside the courthouse, Samsung issued defiant statements, arguing that the verdict was a loss for American consumers because it would limit choice, and vowing to appeal. But privately, this legal defeat was a heavy blow to Samsung's pride. An internal Samsung document from the trial even showed Apple's own lawyers quoting a Samsung manager's reaction, "It's time to rethink our design." The verdict was a clear sign that Samsung needed to change course or risk further punishment. Apple was emboldened. Feeling the wind at its back, Apple moved quickly to capitalize on the win. The company filed motions to ban the sale of several Samsung models that the jury found infringing. This was the real threat. More than money, Apple wanted Samsung's products off the market. If successful, Apple could severely hamper Samsung's momentum by making it pull popular Galaxy phones from store shelves. However, Judge Koh was reluctant to grant sweeping injunctions. She noted that determining the true impact of patented features on sales was complex, and in late 2012, she denied Apple's request for a permanent sales ban on Samsung devices. The war would continue on store shelves, not just in the courtroom. Flushed with victory, Apple wasn't about to let up. In fact, Apple immediately launched a second lawsuit in the US against Samsung, targeting newer products that weren't covered in the first trial. Devices like the Galaxy S3 and Galaxy Note that Samsung released in 2011 to 2012. The billion-dollar verdict was not the end. It was merely the end of the beginning. Samsung and Apple both dug in for a prolonged fight, even as appeals and post-trial motions in the first case were just getting started. After the 2012 verdict, the Apple-Samsung war entered a grueling new phase. A war of attrition through appeals, retrials, and a second US trial. The initial verdict made headlines, but in such high-stakes patent litigation, nothing is truly final until years of appeals are exhausted. Samsung moved to appeal and overturn as much of the verdict as possible, while Apple fought to preserve its win. The conflict shifted from the dramatic jury trial to the slower, more technical arena of post-trial legal procedure. Yet there were still a few fireworks to come. In March 2013, Judge Lucy Koh made a surprising ruling that cut down Apple's victory. She found that the jury had made errors in how they calculated part of the $1.05 billion damages figure. As a result, Judge Koh voided about $450 million of the award and ordered a retrial on damages for certain products. Overnight, Apple's billion-dollar win was reduced to about $599 million, pending a new mini-trial to figure out the rest. For Samsung, this was a small reprieve, an opportunity to reduce the financial hit. That retrial took place in November 2013. During this damages retrial, Apple asked for $379 million in additional damages, while Samsung argued the number should be only $52 million. In a moment of candor rare for this battle, a Samsung representative in court conceded that some Samsung products did include elements of Apple's property. It was as close to an admission of copying as the world had seen from Samsung. In the end, the jury in the retrial awarded Apple $290 million, bringing the total damages from the first case back up to roughly $929 million. The figure was still enormous, if a bit shy of the original headline number. Samsung immediately filed an appeal on that outcome as well. Meanwhile, the second U.S. lawsuit Apple had launched was making its way to trial. This case, held in the spring of 2014, also before Judge Koh in San Jose, focused on a different set of patents and newer Samsung models. Apple accused Samsung of infringing patents like slide to unlock, universal search, autocorrect, and quick link detection, among others. Samsung counterclaimed with a couple of its own patents, one for organizing photos, one for video transmission. By now, observers called these proceedings Round 2 of the Apple-Samsung prize fight. The second trial was notable because Google's role was more visible. Some of the features Apple accused Samsung of copying, like universal search, were part of Android's core software, so Google engineers testified in Samsung's defense, highlighting how intricately this battle was tied to the wider Apple versus Android competition. The trial concluded in May 2014 with a mixed verdict. Apple won again, but the damages were relatively small, about $119.6 million, a far cry from the billions Apple sought. The jury found Samsung had infringed Apple's slide to unlock patent and a couple of others, but cleared Samsung on some claims. They also found Apple had infringed one of Samsung's minor patents, the photo gallery one, and awarded Samsung a mere $158,400 in damages. Both numbers are minuscule compared to the original amount sought by both companies. One reporter noted dryly of this outcome. Indeed, Apple had asked for over $2 billion in this trial, and Samsung had asked for $6 million on its counterclaims. The 2014 verdict was essentially a token victory for Apple, affirming that Samsung did infringe in some ways, but with damages so small that it was more a moral victory than a financial one. It suggested that the tide of the war was no longer clearly in Apple's favor. Samsung, while not scoring a big win, had succeeded in limiting the damage in round 2. Even as these trials went on, behind-the-scenes battles were playing out. Samsung filed appeals in higher courts to try to overturn the 2012 verdict entirely. Apple continued to seek sales bans, returning to Judge Koh, and even appealing to the U.S. Court of Appeals for the Federal Circuit for an injunction. There were also Patent Office re-examinations. In late 2012 and 2013, the U.S. Patent Office began rechecking the validity of some Apple patents at issue. They tentatively invalidated Apple's pinch-to-zoom patent and some aspects of the bounce-back patent, casting doubt on parts of Apple's case. Samsung seized on these developments to argue that Apple's victories might be built on sand if the patents were knocked out, though final decisions on patent validity would take years and appeals of their own. The war also spread to trade agencies. Samsung took a case to the U.S. International Trade Commission, accusing Apple of infringing a Samsung patent on 3G wireless technology. In June 2013, the ITC actually ruled in Samsung's favor and ordered that certain older models of iPhones and iPads be banned from U.S. import because they violated Samsung's patent. This was a rare win for Samsung on American soil, but Apple had an ace up its sleeve. Since the ban involved standards-essential patents, technology needed for industry standards, the Obama administration stepped in. In August 2013, the U.S. Trade Representative vetoed the ITC's ban, effectively overruling Samsung's win on public policy grounds. It was the first such veto of an ITC import ban since the 1980s, and Samsung's moment of triumph was short-lived. Ironically, just days later, the ITC decided a separate case and banned some older Samsung phones for infringing Apple's patents. Each company saw small victories snatched away and minor defeats imposed, further entrenching the stalemate. By 2014, 3 years into the conflict, fatigue was setting in. The two giants had spent untold millions on legal fees. Executives who once might have been working on new products were being deposed for court cases. Steve Jobs had passed away in October 2011, not living to witness the dramatic verdicts his crusade had yielded. Samsung's patriarch Lee Kun-hee had been hospitalized in 2014 due to a heart attack, effectively ending his direct role in the company's day-to-day battles. His son, Lee Jae-yong, began to take on more leadership. The war was increasingly being carried forward by successors and lawyers. Apple had won significant battles, but Samsung remained a formidable opponent, still the world's largest smartphone maker by unit volume, still a crucial supplier to Apple in some areas, and still very much in the fight. In fact, by the mid-2010s, Samsung had achieved Lee Kun-hee's longtime goal. It had become the top-selling phone manufacturer globally, surpassing even Nokia's past dominance and outpacing Apple in market share. Apple, meanwhile, though selling fewer units, was extraordinarily profitable, often commanding over 70% of the entire smartphone industry's profits. In a sense, both companies were winning in different ways in the marketplace, even as they battled each other in court. The legal war was inching toward an endgame, but not before one final twist involving the highest court in the land. In 2016, the U.S. Supreme Court agreed to hear an appeal on the Apple versus Samsung case, specifically on the question of how damages should be calculated for design patent infringement. Samsung argued that the $399 million portion of damages it owed for infringing Apple's design patents, like the shape of the iPhone, was calculated incorrectly. According to a 19th century statute, a patent violator could be liable for all profits from sales of an infringing article of manufacture. Apple had convinced lower courts that the article was the entire smartphone, thus entitling Apple to all the profits Samsung made on certain phones. Samsung contended the damages should only be tied to the specific components or design elements, not the whole phone. In December 2016, the Supreme Court handed Samsung a victory on that point, unanimously ruling that a damaged award for design patent infringement could indeed be based on just a component of a product, not necessarily the entire product. The Supreme Court did not decide the final number, but it sent the case back to lower court to figure out a proper damages calculation under the new guidance. This decision broke new legal ground and signaled that Apple's once seemingly unassailable $1 billion triumph would be reduced further. A retrial on damages for the design patents was set for May 2018 in San Jose. As this retrial approached, something unexpected happened. Apple and Samsung, at long last, decided to settle. While lawyers dueled in court, Apple and Samsung were also fighting a fierce marketing and product battle on the streets, a clash of brand and innovation that was every bit as intense as the legal fight. The rivalry not only played out in legal filings, but also in advertisements, store counters, and consumers' minds worldwide. Samsung adopted an aggressive marketing strategy that openly poked fun at Apple and its devoted fans. Starting around 2011, Samsung launched the famous Next Big Thing ad campaign. In one memorable TV commercial, a line of hip, young people wait outside an Apple store for the latest iPhone, only to ogle in surprise as passers-by flaunt the new Samsung Galaxy S2. "The next big thing is already here," the ad proclaimed, slyly suggesting that Samsung's phone had features the iPhone lacked. The ad directly mocked the almost cult-like following of Apple, portraying them as blind followers missing out on better technology. This was bold and provocative, and it was just the beginning. Samsung's marketing grew only more combative. In subsequent years, Samsung ran ads targeting specific perceived iPhone weaknesses, When Apple's iPhone users were often seen crowding around power outlets in airports, Samsung's wall hugger campaign in 2014 joked that iPhone owners were wall huggers tied to chargers, while the Galaxy S5 boasted an extended battery life and removable battery. Another series of Samsung ads dubbed Fanboys caricatured Apple enthusiasts as mindless loyalists who waited in long lines for minor iPhone upgrades, oblivious to features Samsung phones already had. These ads were sharp, funny, and sometimes biting, a clear signal that Samsung was not afraid to throw punches in public. Samsung's global marketing chief, Young-hee Lee, later explained the philosophy. In North America, we were aggressive with our marketing toward competitors. We went at them head-on, she said, calling the campaigns relevant, bold, and right. Samsung saw advertising as a battlefield to win hearts and minds, just as important as any courtroom. If we think it is right, we pursue it relentlessly, Lee said of Samsung's approach, highlighting how the company's culture of relentless pursuit applied not just to technology, but to beating competitors in perception. Apple, by contrast, did not deign to mention Samsung in its own ads. True to its brand, Apple's marketing remained focused on Apple products and the experiences they offered. Slick, emotional ads highlighted the iPhone's design or the iPad's capabilities, without referencing competitors. Apple's philosophy was to build a strong brand mystique, one where Apple was the gold standard and others were mostly invisible. This asymmetry in marketing reflected the company's personalities. Samsung was scrappy, eager to prove itself, and to directly challenge the industry leader. Apple exuded confidence, acting as if it was above the fray, even while subtly feeling the competitive heat. Beyond ads, the company sparred in product launches and features, an innovation arms race fueled by their rivalry. After the iPhone set the template in 2007, Samsung's strategy under Lee Kun-hee's directive was to iterate fast and explore every niche. Samsung released smartphones in all shapes and sizes, often experimenting with features. In 2011, Samsung introduced the Galaxy Note, a phone with an enormous screen, at the time, of 5.3 inches and a stylus pen. Many in the industry initially chuckled at this phablet, phone-tablet hybrid. Even Apple's Steve Jobs had famously dismissed the idea of very large phones, saying no one's going to buy that, and pointing out you can't get your hand around them easily. But consumers loved the bigger display, and the Galaxy Note pioneered a new category. Samsung had identified a demand that Apple wasn't serving. Indeed, Samsung's success with large-screen phones eventually pressured Apple to follow suit. Apple would later release the iPhone 6 and 6 Plus in 2014, finally offering bigger screens and tacitly acknowledging that Samsung had been right about phablets. It was a strategic win for Samsung in the product war. They had forced Apple to change course for fear of losing customers who wanted larger displays. This pattern repeated in other areas. Samsung loaded its phones with features: early adoption of 4G LTE connectivity, expandable memory slots, higher megapixel cameras, water resistance, you name it. Some features were genuinely ahead, like Samsung's early OLED screens, which were vibrant and eventually became the industry standard, including Apple later buying OLED panels from Samsung for iPhones. While others felt gimmicky, Apple, true to its ethos, refrained from adding features just for spec's sake. It moved slowly, adding technologies when they felt mature and necessary. The difference was Apple's essentialism versus Samsung's diversification. Apple's approach was once described as a lesson in essentialism: focus on a few products and make them exceptional. While Samsung practiced diversification, trying many approaches and seeing what worked. Neither philosophy was inherently superior. In fact, the competition between them arguably drove both to improve. Consumers saw rapid advances each year: better screens, faster processors, Apple's custom A-series chips versus Samsung's Exynos chips, improved mobile cameras, and new form factors like the Samsung Edge displays with curved sides, or later Samsung's experiments with folding phones. Meanwhile, corporate culture differences influenced how each company competed. Apple was famously secretive and centralized, a reflection of Steve Jobs' singular vision. Products were developed in cloistered teams with an obsession over detail, and a mandate to think different. Marketing centered on elegance and a near-magical aura around products. Samsung, in contrast, had a more sprawling organization. As a chaebol company, Samsung Electronics was just one part of a larger empire, but within it, divisions sometimes operated with relative independence. Samsung's culture, shaped by Lee Kun-hee's new management principles, encouraged a constant sense of crisis. Lee drilled into Samsung's managers that they must never become complacent. He would remind them that success today could vanish tomorrow if they didn't fight for every inch. This led Samsung to be extremely aggressive, willing to take risks and also willing to copy or acquire ideas if it meant keeping up with competitors. The pressure to win was intense. Executive meetings at Samsung could last 10 hours with Lee grilling his staff, instilling a near fear of failure. In the smartphone contest, that meant Samsung was not ashamed to be a fast follower. If Apple had a great idea, Samsung would adopt and improve it if possible, and do so quickly. Lee's philosophy was essentially get ahead by any means, whereas Jobs was be the first and best at all costs. These differing philosophies fueled the conflict. Apple saw Samsung's tactics as shameless copying, and Samsung saw Apple as a tyrant trying to box it out of an industry. Through the early to mid-2010s, advertising battles continued to spice up the rivalry. Each time Apple launched a new iPhone model, Samsung was ready with a counter-campaign highlighting what its Galaxy phones could do that the iPhone couldn't. One year it was NFC and mobile payments, another year it was multi-window multitasking, another year low-light camera performance. Samsung kept the pressure on. Apple responded not by mentioning Samsung, but by doubling down on its brand image. For example, the iconic Shot on iPhone campaign showcased beautiful photographs taken with iPhones, indirectly countering any spec sheet bragging by implying it's not about specs, it's about the results. In subtle ways, Apple did acknowledge Samsung's presence. Apple's keynote presentations would sometimes include slides comparing iPhone customer satisfaction or performance metrics against the competition, unspecified, but clearly meaning Samsung. This war pushed both companies to invest heavily in marketing. Samsung at one point was spending more on marketing than even Apple, blanketing the globe with Galaxy ads, sponsoring big events, and enlisting celebrities, all to elevate its brand from a mere electronics maker to a lifestyle icon like Apple. By 2015, the public sparring had somewhat mellowed as both companies matured in their positions. Apple securely profitable with a loyal following, Samsung dominating Android sales and innovating in hardware. Both companies also started facing new competitive pressures. Chinese smartphone makers like Huawei and Xiaomi were rising, and new technologies like mobile AI and voice assistants were becoming the next arena. Apple's Siri versus Samsung's later Bixby, etc. The Apple versus Samsung rivalry, while still fierce, was evolving from an all-out war to an enduring competitive dynamic. They learned from each other. Apple began to offer more screen sizes and even a stylus, Apple Pencil for iPad, areas Samsung had validated. Samsung, for its part, dramatically improved the design and user experience of its products to shake off the old copycat label, even developing its own design language and UI customizations for Android. No great corporate war would be complete without allegations of espionage and betrayal, and the Apple-Samsung conflict had plenty. In any high-stakes battle, each side is desperate for any edge, and at times the quest to win crossed ethical lines, or at least appeared to. One of the most scandalous episodes came to light in late 2013 during the ongoing litigation. It turned out that Samsung's legal team had obtained and shared confidential information that was meant to be restricted to attorneys' eyes only. Specifically, Apple had a private licensing agreement with Nokia, one of the other phone makers Apple had tangled with. And details of this Apple-Nokia deal were filed under seal in the court case. These were sensitive documents. Knowing the exact terms Apple offered Nokia or other companies could give Samsung huge insight into Apple's strategy. According to court filings, Samsung's lawyers improperly disclosed this secret licensing information to Samsung executives. In fact, about 50 Samsung employees ended up seeing the confidential details of Apple's patent licensing agreements with Nokia, Ericsson, Sharp, and Philips. In other words, Samsung was accused of spying on Apple's pricing and deal strategy with competitors. The revelation infuriated the judge. Observers called it a brazen act of corporate espionage during active litigation. Nokia even claimed that a Samsung executive used the illicit knowledge during negotiations by hinting he knew Apple's terms. Judge Lucy Koh demanded answers. How did such a breach happen? Samsung's explanation, that it was inadvertent, didn't satisfy many. To Apple and Nokia, it looked like Samsung had been caught red-handed peeking at the enemy's playbook. This incident led to sanctions on Samsung's outside counsel and cast a cloud over Samsung's conduct. It was a stark reminder that this war wasn't just about lofty ideals of innovation, it could get dirty. From Apple's perspective, betrayal had been a theme from the start. Steve Jobs felt betrayed by Google's Eric Schmidt, an Apple board member who learned about the iPhone. Then Google developed Android. He also felt betrayed by Samsung, a company Apple trusted as a supplier only to see it become a rival that, in Apple's view, ripped off Apple's designs. One former Apple executive was quoted as saying, "Apple treated Samsung like a new partner when developing the first iPhone, sharing product roadmaps and needs, all under strict confidentiality, and that Samsung then suddenly emerged with a very similar product line." Whether or not Samsung ever truly misused any insider knowledge from a supplier relationship, the perception at Apple was that Samsung could not be trusted. Steve Jobs' outrage, his vow to spend every penny Apple had to right what he saw as wrong, was fueled by that sense of personal betrayal. Samsung, too, had its own feelings of betrayal. From Samsung's viewpoint, Apple was a partner that turned around and sued them, threatening a business relationship that had been worth billions. Tim Cook, who managed Apple's supplier relationships before becoming CEO, was reportedly uneasy with suing Samsung for this reason. And indeed, after the lawsuit started, Apple began an effort to reduce reliance on Samsung. This was strategy as much as emotion. Apple didn't want to fund a rival by giving Samsung so much component business, and it didn't want to be vulnerable to supply disruptions if relations soured further. Over the next few years, Apple invested heavily in other suppliers. For instance, Apple dual-sourced and then fully shifted its custom A-series chip manufacturing to TSMC in Taiwan, cutting Samsung's foundry out of the lucrative iPhone chip orders. Apple also started using screens from LG Display and Japan Display, and later Chinese BOE, to lessen dependence on Samsung Display, though Samsung remained the only source for certain cutting-edge OLED screens for a while. To Samsung, losing this business must have felt like payback, a financial blow dealt as part of the war's fallout. The once symbiotic Apple-Samsung supply relationship was fraying. They still did business. To this day, Samsung supplies some of the most advanced screens and memory chips Apple needs. But tensions made it increasingly transactional and guarded. There were also whispers, never fully confirmed, of clandestine meetings and back-channel dealings. Large companies often use behind-the-scenes talks to settle disputes quietly. In 2014 to 2015, as the war dragged on, there were reports, unverified publicly, that Apple and Samsung executives held secret meetings to discuss an out-of-court settlement. Given that the formal court-ordered talks in 2012 had failed, any later détente likely came from a cooler assessment of mutual interest. By then, both companies had spent over $400 million each on legal fees, as some analysts estimated. Money that bought lots of headaches but few tangible rewards. Moreover, the smartphone market was maturing. The growth was slowing, and new battles like the race for AI or wearables were emerging. In a twist, Apple and Samsung even found themselves on the same side in a different legal fight. In 2017, both joined to resist Qualcomm's patent licensing practices, a surprising alignment that would have been unthinkable at the height of their feud. The enemy of my enemy can be my friend, at least temporarily. They essentially stockpiled patents both offensively and defensively, a strategy sometimes dubbed mutually assured destruction in tech, suggesting that if both sides have enough patents, they reach a stalemate where suing further could hurt both. In the end, the espionage and backroom aspects of the Apple versus Samsung war underscore that this was not a gentlemanly disagreement. It was more akin to a Cold War that sometimes ran hot, a conflict where each side pushed boundaries in pursuit of victory. But after years of conflict, even the mightiest of rivals can grow weary and seek a way out. By 2015, the war that had dominated headlines was gradually moving out of the spotlight. The lawsuits continued, but the public's attention shifted to the latest iPhones and Galaxy phones themselves rather than their courtroom proxies. Both companies were winning and losing in different arenas. Apple with record-breaking iPhone sales, and Samsung with an unparalleled global reach in the Android market. There was a growing sense that this protracted conflict needed resolution, and indeed the final act was approaching. In December 2015, Samsung agreed to pay Apple $548 million toward the judgment in the first patent case. This was not a full surrender. Samsung explicitly reserved the right to get money back if future appeals changed the outcome. But it signaled that Samsung was positioning to end the fight. The Supreme Court's involvement in 2016, as mentioned, sent the case into a possible retrial on a portion of damages. Rather than drag on through yet another trial and endless appeals, Apple and Samsung finally decided to call it quits. On June 27, 2018, nearly 7 years after the war began, Apple and Samsung filed notice in court that they had reached a settlement, bringing an end to all the patent litigation between them. The terms of the settlement were confidential, but it effectively closed the book on the smartphone patent wars between the two giants. By this point, the once $1 billion verdict had been whittled down. Samsung's payments to Apple totaled somewhere around $539 million in the end, a figure reported after a May 2018 damages retrial. It's been said that neither side was fully happy with how it ended, which is often the case in a hard-fought settlement. Apple had wanted more and permanent injunctions. Samsung resented paying anything at all. But both companies had bigger priorities by then. Apple was looking toward new product categories and services, and Samsung was focusing on emerging technologies, and also dealing with an internal leadership crisis, as Samsung's de facto leader, Lee Jae-yong, was embroiled in a political scandal in South Korea around that time. The settlement allowed Apple and Samsung to move on. The final legal filings were anticlimactic, a far cry from the dramatic opening salvos. A brief note to Judge Ko, and the case was close. The thermonuclear war Steve Jobs had declared was, at long last, over. The Apple versus Samsung smartphone war was unlike any feud the tech industry had seen before. It will be remembered not just for its courtroom twists and billion-dollar verdicts, but for how it shaped the trajectory of both companies and the smartphone market as a whole. In the end, what is the legacy of this epic corporate conflict? For Steve Jobs, the war was part of his final chapter. He had unleashed the iPhone and saw the competition rush in to emulate Apple's success. His uncompromising stance, calling Android a stolen product and demanding a fight to the death, set Apple on its course of aggressive protection of its IP. Jobs did not live to see Apple's courtroom victory in 2012. But that victory was in many ways the fulfillment of his vow to right this wrong. In an emotional sense, the patent war was an extension of Jobs' lifelong belief that great artists don't steal, they innovate. His flaw, perhaps, was a degree of ruthlessness and a black and white view of competitors. Yet his legacy from this war is that Apple stood up forcefully for its ideas, cementing the notion that design has value worth fighting over. For Tim Cook, who took over as Apple's CEO in 2011, the war was a baptism by fire. Known as a cool-headed operations maestro, Cook inherited a fight he hadn't started. He was reportedly more peace-seeking, worried about the business fallout, but he carried Jobs' torch and saw it through. Under Cook's leadership, Apple simultaneously fought Samsung and separated from it, diversifying suppliers and lessening the dependency that had made Apple vulnerable. Cook's emotional arc was less fiery than Jobs's, but in the narrative of the war, he emerges as the pragmatist general, one who perhaps quietly questioned the cost of battle, even as he led Apple to continued prosperity. By negotiating the end of the war in 2018, Cook demonstrated that he knew when to declare enough. His legacy is tied to Apple's unprecedented financial success during and after the war. Apple reached heights like becoming the world's first trillion-dollar company on Cook's watch. And showing that focus on innovation, Apple kept rolling out new iPhones yearly despite the distraction, is the best revenge. Cook also managed to maintain a working relationship with Samsung when needed for components, indicating a level of practical diplomacy that served Apple well long-term. For Lee Kun-hee and Samsung's leadership, the war was both a test and an affirmation. Lee's ambition was for Samsung to become a top-tier global brand, not just a supplier. By the mid-2010s, Samsung had indeed become the global smartphone leader in volume, surpassing all rivals. The conflict with Apple, though costly, had inadvertently elevated Samsung's profile. Suddenly, Samsung was spoken of in the same breath as Apple, not just as an imitator, but as a competitor. Lee Kun-hee's insistence on changing everything and focusing on quality paid off as Samsung's products improved drastically through the war years. Samsung shook off some of the early derision. By late this war, many reviewers and consumers acknowledged Samsung as an innovator too. Curved screens, big phones, etc. However, Samsung's reputation took a hit from the court findings of copying and the whiff of unethical behavior, like the info leak. Lee's own flaw, a win-at-all-cost culture, may have contributed to those missteps. Yet Samsung's resilience is a key legacy. Even after being slammed with a $1 billion verdict, Samsung adapted, changed designs. Later, Samsung phones moved away from copying Apple's interface and developed a more distinct style, and continued to thrive. Lee Kun-hee did not see the war's end. After 2014, he was incapacitated, and he passed away in 2020. But Samsung's handling of the war, fighting ferociously, losing some battles, but ultimately maintaining its empire, is part of his legacy as the architect of a company that could go toe-to-toe with Silicon Valley's finest. Tech companies became far more careful after 2012 about blatant copying. Competitors saw that even a company as powerful as Samsung could be held accountable for mimicking a rival too closely. The war also exposed the inefficiencies of the patent system. The fact that a lay jury had to decide complex matters of software and design led to much debate. Many argued the case showed patents were both sword and shield, sometimes too blunt an instrument in fast-moving tech. There were calls for patent reform spurred by this very fight. For consumers, the smartphone war accelerated innovation despite threats of product bans. Apple expanded screens and diversified, while Samsung dramatically improved software and customer service. Relentless competition fueled groundbreaking R&D, driving technology forward at breakneck speed. The Apple versus Samsung saga defined an era full of leaked emails, secret deals, and courtroom battles. Steve Jobs' explosive vow of thermonuclear warfare epitomized the ruthless stakes at play. Neither titan claimed total victory. Apple dominated legally but couldn't eliminate Samsung. Samsung thrived commercially, yet faced lasting accusations. This corporate thriller taught an unforgettable lesson. Ruthless ambition and obsession are essential to reaching the top. It revealed that fierce rivalry doesn't just reshape companies. It drives them to billion-dollar heights and trillion-dollar valuations. Jobs, Cook, and Lee Kun-hee proved that only those willing to fight relentlessly and adapt survive the brutal climb to the summit. The war is over, but its thrilling legacy endures, a stark reminder of what it takes to conquer the relentless battleground of innovation. And that's the explosive story behind Apple vs. Samsung, two corporate giants whose fierce battle reshaped technology and changed the smartphone game forever. This billion-dollar rivalry proves just how ruthless innovation can be and how relentless you must be to reach the top. If you enjoyed this high-stakes showdown, hit the like button, share this dramatic tale with your friends, and subscribe to DarkoX for more gripping stories from the thrilling world of business and technology. Until next time, stay sharp, stay informed.